I hope things are going well. I know that for some of us, things are not going well, that this pandemic has been hard, that we're going through difficult, unique personal challenges. And I know that sometimes we wonder when we or those we love are going through depression or hard things, why doesn't God just show up in a flash of blinding light and end all of the pain and all of the darkness? And today, I don't want to offer a cheap answer to that or an overly simplified answer to that, but I do want to wrestle with you and let you know that other people have wrestled with that question too. There's this moment in Alma chapter 32 when Alma and his friends are on this mission to the Zoramites, and some of them are rich and maybe a little prideful. And there's this group of them who have been cast out and considered lesser because they're poor, and they're in pain and they're feeling like that they don't belong and they're outcasts. And one of them comes up to Alma and he says, "What shall we do? We've been cast out of our synagogues and there's no place for us to worship." And sometimes I look at the pain in the world, the depression and the anxiety and the poverty and the war and the suffering, and I think, what shall we do? And I get overwhelmed. But the prophet sees it differently. And I don't think this is a lack of compassion, but I think he's able to see that God works in darkness, that God works, that our suffering is actually the fertile soil for our heavenly parents to come and bless us. It says, when Alma beheld with great joy, for he beheld that their afflictions had truly humbled them. He knows that sometimes the hard things in our lives are the very opportunities for God to come to us. I don't know if you've ever sensed that the night is beautiful, that you go outside and the darkness itself is beautiful. I came across this poem by this German poet named Rilke. He says, "The flame limits the world to the circle it illumines and excludes all the rest. But the dark embraces everything, shapes and shadows, creatures and me, people, nations, just as they are. It lets me imagine a great presence stirring beside me. I believe in the night." Sometimes we think that God is only within this little sphere of light where we can see, but I believe in the nighttime. I believe in the moments of darkness that our heavenly parents are there coming to seek us out and to be with us and sit with us, even if maybe they don't fix our problems or change our situation. They sit with us, and we can imagine a great presence stirring beside us when we can't see. That's the place of faith. And that's what Alma is talking about in Alma chapter 32. He says that some people say, like, look, if you would just show me a sign, then we'll believe. He says, is this faith? He says, no, if a man or woman knows a thing, he has no cause to believe, for he knows it. He goes on to say in this very, very famous verse, faith is not to have a perfect knowledge. If you have faith, you hope for things which are not seen, which are true. Faith actually thrives and lives in the darkness, in the place where you can't see, where things are uncertain. It is what happens underground to that seed, right? Which you can't see. He says, look, you need to trust that God is merciful. He imparts his words by angels unto men, women, and children, even if you can't maybe see those angels or hear their voices. And he says, look, maybe you don't believe right now. Maybe you have a hard time believing that God is there for you, but if you can no more than desire to believe, like if you just want to believe that there is a God, that our heavenly parents love you, that they're there with you, then let this desire work in you until you can give place for a portion of my words. And then he kind of compares his words to a seed. And he says, I want you to give place that this seed may be planted in your heart. And I want you to just sort of like think about what does that mean? When life dumps dirt on you, to plant a seed of hope. Hope that there is God. Hope that there is a future that can be brighter. Hope that you can feel love again. Hope that things are gonna be better. He says, plant this seed. So what does it look like to plant that seed? What are the gestures or the actions that maybe it's prayer, maybe it's service, maybe it's worship at church, maybe it's loving your family, maybe it's forgiveness. But what does it mean to plant the seed in the darkness? He says, look, something's going to happen. Verse 28 is one of the most beautiful verses. He says, if you plant it and it's a good seed, it's going to begin to swell, and you're going to say this is a good seed, for it begins to enlarge my soul. And I think that that's an important first step. Maybe you don't feel any of these other things, enlightening my understanding, or it begins to be delicious unto me. I had a friend who struggled with depression for a lot of years, and he prayed and he prayed and he prayed, and he didn't feel like God answered his prayers. And he said he believed there was no God. He couldn't believe that a loving God would let him suffer like that. And so he got to this place where he considered himself an atheist. And one day he was talking with some friends about love. And all of a sudden he was just overwhelmed with this feeling of love. And he said, I could only describe that as God. It felt like I was being encircled in arms. And he said, I now believe that there's a God, that he loves me, and I want to feel that again. And he says, I look back on those dark times, those silent times where I didn't feel God. And I realized that I was growing in compassion and empathy and patience and love for those who were struggling around me. And now he's studying to be a therapist to help people who are going through hard times. And sometimes you'll, in addition to your soul being enlarged and becoming a more compassionate person, it'll begin to enlighten your understanding. You'll have ideas come to you. You'll have thoughts come to you. Some of my artist friends talk about how sometimes the darkness is a place where creativity can blossom. It pushes them into this kind of quiet internal space. And eventually it begins to be delicious. And you begin to sense that there is something beautiful here, something sweet here. The way he describes this deliciousness, I love. He says, after you've tasted this light, is your knowledge perfect? Nay, neither must you lay aside your faith. And I love that he talks about tasting light, because normally we talk about seeing light, right? Light is something that we perceive with our eyes, but he says, you taste it. He's pointing to the fact that sometimes our experience with God isn't something that you can articulate according to the five senses, right? Like, what is the taste of light? What is the smell of grace? What is the texture of love? What is the sound of hope? What does peace look like when I close my eyes? Those are questions that you can't really answer, but we experience things with God that don't maybe make sense according to our natural senses. And we can begin to sense this swelling inside us, the beginning of a seed growing underground. And you can't see it, but you can perceive that something is happening there. And it's real and it's good. And eventually he promises that what starts underground and you can't see it, and it's in the darkness and under the soil, ultimately breaks forth. And eventually, if you nourish it, it shall be a tree springing up unto everlasting life. And because of your diligence, faith, and patience, and those three words show up 3 times in these 3 verses, you shall pluck the fruit, which is sweet above all that is sweet. You'll feast upon this fruit even until you're filled, that you shall hunger not, neither shall you thirst. I know right now that we hunger and we thirst and we hurt and we yearn and we want something, but there's this promise that one day God is going to fill our need. And I want to just talk about one seed that I want to invite you to plant. The seed is prayer. In Alma 33, he's quoting Zenos, and he says, "Thou didst hear me because of mine afflictions and my sincerity." Sometimes our afflictions sort of push us into more authentic forms of prayer. And we may pray our grief, our sadness, our loneliness, our anguish. We may pray our anger or our frustration to God. And he says, it's because of thy Son that thou hast been merciful unto me. Therefore, I will cry unto thee in all mine afflictions, for in thee is my joy. That as our prayers turn us to God, then ultimately Christ's mercy turns that anguish into joy. Alma 34 talks about praying all over the place, in our fields and in our houses and with our families, in our secret places, in our closets, and in our wilderness, those barren, desolate, sort of lonely places. And it says in verse 27, "Yea, and when you don't cry unto the Lord, let your hearts be full, drawn out in prayer unto him continually." We can live our prayers as we drive, as we shower, as we play soccer, as we're quarantined to our home. We live toward God as if there is a God, as if our actions matter, as if there is someone who is attentive to us in the midst of all of these things that we're doing. And then in verse 28, he says, and then turn your prayer into a verb. He says, after you've done all these things, if you turn away the needy and the naked and visit not the sick and the afflicted and impart not your substance, if you have, to those who stand in need, if I say unto you, behold, your prayer is vain. We need to sort of live our prayers out loud. And sometimes when we're going through hard times, the best way to live our prayers, to live as if there is a God, is to open our eyes to those around us and recognize that other people are suffering. He invites us in verse 38 to live in thanksgiving daily, to recognize that there are beautiful things in the midst of our darkness. But ultimately, the seed he says that he wants us to plant in our hearts is Jesus Christ. He says, begin to believe in the Son of God, that he will come to redeem his people from everything, from our sorrows and our anguish and our depression and our darkness. And he says, plant this word in your hearts. And as it beginneth to swell, even so nourish it by your faith, and it will become a tree, springing up in you unto everlasting life. And then may God grant unto you that your burdens may be light through the joy of his Son. And I just want to testify that if you have patience and bear with those afflictions with a firm hope, that you shall one day rest from all your afflictions. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.